and in the Isle of Man and Alderney. And I believe that that kind of local form of organisation at a local community level, but joining up into more of a national voice as part of an international story is critically important. And although I might have worked at Friends of the Earth and been Chief Executive at Friends of the Earth and now Chief Executive at the Wildlife Trusts, of course, there's one other organisation out there that has a sort of similar structure, and that is CPRE. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to join you today. I think the work you do is critically important, and I think we stand out really as organisations, as the Wildlife Trust and CPRE, and of course Friends of the Earth, as organisations that have that local community structure. I think that's incredibly important for bringing about the bold and essential changes that are needed in society to tackle the climate and environmental crisis. So yes, the title of my talk today is called How the Countryside Can Help Tackle the Climate Emergency. And the first thing to do is just to talk briefly about how we are living through, of course, a climate crisis, but also a nature crisis. And in a way, the good news, the only good news about that, is that they are inextricably linked. You know, for too long in my career, people, sometimes even in the environmental movement, sometimes talk about the climate crisis and the nature crisis as if they're somehow separate. And organisations sometimes will have very different people working on them. But in fact, we have no hope of solving the climate crisis unless we can put nature into recovery at scale and at pace. And we have no hope of solving the nature crisis unless we can tackle the climate crisis. And if you need a clue as to how much these are linked, all you have to do is think back and those graphs that I'm sure you've seen many times before. And I decided to not show you PowerPoints today. I thought on a Saturday, let's go without PowerPoints. But if you think of those graphs I'm sure you've seen before about how carbon emissions, carbon concentrations in the atmosphere have varied over millennia in the Earth. And you know how they are linked also to temperature over time. And the reason that the Earth over its history has moved from warm periods like the one we're in now into glacials and cold periods, ice ages in other words, it starts off by little wobbles in how the Earth rotates around the sun. These are called Milankovitch cycles. And just how you have those wobbles, that's enough to change the energy from the sun to actually start the tipping of the Earth system into a new state. But it's not enough. It's not enough to do that. The only way you can then explain how you have those shifts from cold periods, from ice ages into warm periods, is if you then factor in the carbon that goes into the atmosphere for that time. So there's a lot more carbon in the atmosphere for those warm periods, and that's why the Earth is warmer during interglacials like the one we're in now, and it's much colder when we're in ice ages. I say much colder, only 4 or 5 degrees on average, but that's enough to make the difference between an ice age and a warm period like now. And you have to then ask yourself, well, where does all the carbon go in those cold periods, in those ice ages? Where does the carbon go? And the fact is, of course, it overwhelmingly goes into the biosphere. This is a flux of carbon that you see over time from the living world and, of course, dead biodiversity as well, back into the atmosphere or into the biosphere. So it should be really clear to us how the climate emergencies and the nature emergencies are inextricably linked. In fact, there's another clue. When, of course, that carbon goes into living things during warm periods, and then those living things die, and they go to the bottom of the sea or to swamps or whatever you want to call them, and then they become compressed, what do they turn into over time? They turn into fossil fuels. And then, of course, we burn them. The clue is in the name. Actually, the problem of the climate crisis has been caused by us as humans burning dead biodiversity. And so, in fact, much as we have to stop burning fossil fuels, because when we do that, we're talking about carbon that has been sequestered by living things over millions of years. So it's we can't restore nature fast enough to do that. Nonetheless, the faster we can restore nature and get it sucking carbon back out of the atmosphere again, the better we will solve both these problems. So it's worth just really emphasizing that, how these issues are inextricably linked in so many ways. So when we come back to the question, how can the countryside help us tackle the climate emergency? I've got 5 headings for you to think about this morning. It was quite hard to get back down to 5, I can tell you now, but in the end, I've worked out 5 big headings to think about. And of course, it wouldn't surprise you, given my role as Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trust, the first thing I'm going to say is the countryside can help us tackle the climate emergency by making sure we've got nature in recovery. Of course, the countryside will be absolutely central to putting nature in recovery. And I don't know about you, I'm a bit fed up over many decades of seeing all these graphs of nature going in the wrong direction. And I'm sort of a bit fed up of how perhaps as an environmental movement, too often we've tried to work to try and slow the decline of nature. Well, that's not good enough, is it? We've got to stop the decline and reverse it. Our vision should not be that the next generation inherits a countryside with less nature in it, but not quite as bad as it could have been if we'd not taken action. Actually, I'm sure we all want a situation where the next generation inherits countryside with more nature in it than is in the countryside today. Because the fact is, sadly, we do live in one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. In my lifetime, since the early 1970s, we've seen some catastrophic declines in the abundance of species that were once common are now rare. Particularly bad, say, across our insect species, where we've seen huge losses of some of our insect species. And I want to focus on this issue a little bit about abundance, because again, in the nature conservation community for over 100 years, we've focused a lot around species and diversity, and that's perhaps because of our roots as natural historians. That's totally understandable. And of course, we want to make sure species don't go extinct. Of course, we want to preserve the diversity of our species. But I think we've underplayed the importance of abundance. And actually, when we have species, even if species might still be present, if they're not in the abundance that they should be in nature, they're not going to be performing the ecosystem function and ecosystem services that they should be. It's all very well us making sure bees don't go extinct, but if bees are not there in natural abundance, they're not going to do the jobs for nature and for humans that we need them to do, for example. So I think we need to focus much more on getting nature recovered in abundance. But there's 3 real headings for me then around how we get nature in recovery in the countryside. The first thing is we have to make more space for nature. It's as simple as that. You know, we are living in a sad time where all too often nature is pushed into the little margins, the little copses, the little nature reserves in an otherwise degraded countryside and agricultural desert. You know, we at the Wildlife Trust can be very proud of our nature reserves. We have more nature reserves at the Wildlife Trust than McDonald's has restaurants in the UK. In fact, we have 1,000 more. And when you put them together, we're the UK's 5th largest landowner. So we're very proud of our nature reserves. But it's not enough, of course. They are the tiny pockets, really, of the very best bits of what's left. That's not enough to protect or restore our biodiversity. We need to get to around at least 30% of our land and sea being put into recovery, set aside for nature by 2030, if we're going to have any hope of really turning those trends around that we see in those graphs that we've seen pointing in the wrong direction for too long. And hopefully this year at the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the world will agree to that target and will agree that globally, we're going to try and get 30% of our land and sea into recovery for nature by 2030. And then on biodiversity, we will have that target, that landmark target that we can focus on, that in the same way on climate change, we've been talking about the need to try and keep temperature rises below 1.5 degrees. In the same way on climate change, having that target doesn't necessarily mean we're going to deliver it. Of course, there's a huge amount of effort to get there, but having that area of focus will be really important. And it needs to work. If it's going to do the job for nature, it needs to work at all levels. So it's no good just taking 1/3 of the world somewhere and making sure that's a huge, colossal nature reserve for nature. It's got to work at all levels. So every country needs to have 30% of land and sea set aside and for protection for nature by 2030. Every English county, I would say, has to have around 30% at least for nature recovery by 2030. And actually, it's not even just the quantity either. It is the shape of it as well. Of course, what we need is a network joining up the existing sites of special scientific interest, our existing nature reserves, be they Wildlife Trust, National Trust, RSPB, or local conservation organisations. We need to join the dots, essentially, between those bits of nature that are left and create that nature recovery network so we can really see nature coming back in strength in the way that it absolutely needs to. And the Wildlife Trust, we believe we need a new land designation to do this, because we will all know that we have at the moment lots of different designations for sites of special scientific interest, for areas of outstanding natural beauty, national park designations, of course, the very important greenbelt designations, and so on. But if you think about all of those, they are all designations that roughly keep things as they are. They protect things as they currently are, which is a good thing to do, don't get me wrong. But what we don't have at the moment is a designation that allows you to take a knackered bit of land, essentially, and zone it for nature's recovery. And we think that's critically important if we're going to achieve on this. We should be able to designate areas of the countryside and particular areas around our towns and cities, perhaps overlaying greenbelt actually, and overlaying other designations and saying, yes, we need to protect this, but we need to manage them for nature's recovery and bring nature back in this area. And that's why we think a new designation called Wild Belt that could overlay other designations would be hugely important. So that's the first one, make more space for nature. The second is to restore abundance, exactly what I was talking about before. And we've got to get real about this. If we're going to do this, we have to see a massive reduction in pesticide use in the countryside. You know, pesticides have been the primary reason in why we've lost so many of our farmland birds and so many of our insect populations. And the problem is we've kind of got to a situation in our farming where pesticides and herbicides are used as routine, you know, and they're not being used on occasions and in a very limited way, when they, in a targeted way, to address particular pest infestations. They're being used as a routine. And what we need to see is real targets to cut pesticide use. Now, the European Union is just agreed, or is in the process of agreeing a target to cut pesticide use by 50% by 2030. So the big question for us here in the UK, do we think we can do something similar? And if not, why not? We have to ask that question. We have to be able to use technology and to use much better farming methods to cut our pesticide use, and that's when we will see a restoration in the abundance of our wildlife species. And the third point about how we get nature and recovery is we've got to get nature working again. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, that's all about the focus on ecosystem processes. You know, it's all well and good if we can have, you know, nice diversity of species and nature reserves and so on, and even in abundance. But unless we make sure we've got the conditions where nature can thrive, we won't have nature doing the job that we need it to do. So what do I mean by that? Well, novel concepts, like, for example, making sure our wetlands are wet. Too many of our wetlands are not wet. It sounds ridiculous, but of chalk streams, of course, particularly in your part of the world, the beautiful chalk streams you have in Hampshire, as you know, many of them run dry at times of the year because of over abstraction and other problems. So we absolutely have to focus on making sure our wetlands are wet, that our peat bogs are wet as well, and that actually the sphagnum moss is growing on them and they're restoring. I know you don't have peat bogs in Hampshire, but incredibly important. Then our soils are actually putting carbon into the soil rather than releasing carbon into the atmosphere, which is too many of our agricultural soils are at the moment. Make sure that nutrients are not running off the land into rivers and then into the sea. We absolutely have to make sure that nature is working again. And if we manage to do that, just look at what will happen. If our wetlands are wet, then we have our wetland habitats thriving. And guess what? They're fantastic at capturing carbon. They're fantastic at holding water back in the landscape and making sure that we protect ourselves from extreme weather events. If we can stop nutrients going into rivers, then again, if we don't have nutrient overload going into places like, for example, the Solent, then there's a chance our seagrass habitats and our salt marsh habitats might recover, and they're even better at capturing carbon than Amazon rainforest, for example. So the potential we have if we can get nature working again will be huge. And at times, to get those natural processes working, we will have to do things that some people might call rewilding or whatever as well, making sure nature is working at scale, big enough for the natural processes, and yes, returning species that are missing from our ecosystem. And as you probably know, the Wildlife Trust has done a lot of work on, for example, trying to return beavers, certainly down in Cornwall and Devon, and there's plans for across the country. Beavers are keystone species to make sure we get nature working again, to hold water back in the landscape, to create wetlands, and to make sure it's doing all those jobs that we do. It's kind of crazy at the moment. Across the country, we have thousands of volunteers sometimes building little dams, little leaky dams in our nature reserves to hold water back. But wouldn't it be better to do it with one of our native species that should be here? And I know there's sometimes a lot of debate about returning native species, including, strangely enough, there has been controversy about returning beavers, which I find strange. You know, they are just as much part of our cultural heritage as, I would say, as William Shakespeare, as St. Paul's Cathedral, anything like that. Beavers, for example, are fundamentally part of British ecosystems. And you have to ask yourself this question: if beavers still existed in Britain, would we be trying to exterminate them and eradicate them? I don't think we would. I think the British public would be desperate for them to be here. The same true with so many of our other native species. So we should be bringing them back, unless there's very, very different big challenges about management around them. You know, I understand, for example, wolves and bears would be a bit more complicated and we'd have to put more management in place to do them. But from an ideological point of view, of course, I'd love to see them return because they're keystone species. So we've got to have a much more sensible debate about this in Britain and embrace the fact that this big part of our British culture and British heritage missing for as long as these British species are missing from our landscape. So much to do to get nature working again. The second thing, of course, that the countryside can do to help tackle the climate emergency is to produce good quality, local, sustainable food. And this is, of course, a huge topic at the moment, an incredibly important topic. I want to say a thing or two here about how frustrating it's been to see how some commentators, I think, have used the appalling situation in Ukraine to try and take us back to a model of suggestion that we need ever more intensive agriculture. You know, I think surely it means exactly the opposite. We've had 50, 60 years of intensive agriculture in the UK, funded mostly by taxpayers through subsidies. And look where it's got us. It's got us to exactly the place where in 2022, according to those same commentators, we are dependent on fossil fuel fertilizers from countries like Russia for our food security. That's where intensive high input agriculture has got us. If ever there was a moment for us to stop and think about, surely this is a moment for us to move to genuinely sustainable regenerative agriculture, surely this is it. To tackle the climate crisis, to tackle the nature crisis, and to provide food security in a way that is genuinely sustainable rather than dependent on inputs of fossil fuels and pesticides that come from other countries. And we can do it. It will take a bit of change. It will take a big transformation in our agricultural systems, and it will take perhaps some changes to diets as well. But we can absolutely do it, and we need to do it for so many of these other reasons. So what are the components of this? Well, the first thing I do want to talk about is, for example, diets. Now, we do know it's very clear from tackling climate change, ultimately, we do have to reduce meat consumption. The average levels of meat consumption in this country are way above what is necessarily good for our health and certainly what's good for nature. This does not mean everyone going vegan or vegetarian. You know, much as I say what I'm about to say to you quite regularly, I say it quite often, I myself eat meat, you know, but I try and eat much less meat than I once did. And when I do eat meat, I eat less but better produced meat. So sustainable meat, high quality meat produced locally, and so on. And there is a huge opportunity now when we look at meat alternatives for providing bulk protein, perhaps meat alternatives, say around fast food and so on. That can make a huge difference for nature and climate if we shift to that. And then when we do eat meat, we can enjoy meat that is grown properly and sustainably by local farmers with high animal welfare conditions and so on. And surely that's the way forward we need to go on it. I'll give you this statistic, which I'm sure you know, but over half our agricultural land in this country is associated with animal production in one form or another, either for pasture directly or indeed to grow crops to then feed to that cattle. So if we can reduce meat consumption, it would make a huge difference and create that more space for nature. But the other thing to think about, it's not as if our domestic meat industry is entirely sustainable on UK inputs anyway. Huge amounts of our meat, not least our chickens, our poultry, are dependent on imports of soya, say from places like the Amazon rainforest. So when you see the problems, for example, that have had a lot of attention in the last year in the River Wye, and the appalling pollution you're now getting in the River Wye from high intensity chicken farming in around the River Wye in big sheds, we might say that those are British grown chickens, and yes, those chickens grew up here in those barns in high intensive numbers in the River Wye, but they're being fed almost entirely protein that's been grown mostly in South America. So the idea that those are really British chickens, I think, is rather questionable when they're dependent on inputs from Brazil, say. So we have to move to a much more sustainable system. That means a good look at moving to much more sustainably produced meat. But there's other issues as well. It's about making sure that we have a much more an agricultural landscape where we can have farming and nature side by side. Yes, field margins. Yes, absolutely, you'll be thrilled to know hedgerows. And I'm delighted. I think the work that CPRE has been doing on promoting the importance of hedgerows is incredibly important, because we know that hedgerows can play a huge role, along with field margins, in creating that nature recovery network, joining the dots between our reserves and so on. Yes, a more wooded landscape as well. That doesn't mean that it's what we should certainly avoid is vast areas to plant trees, because very often you get the wrong trees in the wrong place. But actually, I think a move to a lot more agroforestry, so you see agricultural landscapes with a lot more trees and a lot more hedgerows in them, will be very good for nature and very good for farmers as well. And we also need an agricultural system that, for example, stops the runoff. There's so much of our soil at the moment we're losing through soil erosion into our rivers, along with nutrients and silage overflows and so on, causing huge problems. It is a scandal that we're seeing, for example, maize being planted in winter on chalk soils, and you see so much being lost there. Just last summer, I was in the Isle of Wight with Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, and horrified to see maize being planted on a chalk escarpment, would you believe? And guess what? As soon as you look into the field, you see these deep gullies in it. And that's our soil, that's our precious resource being washed off that slope, because you've got that bare soil into the rivers. It makes no sense whatsoever. Now, of course, farmers do need help in this transition. And we, along with the Wildlife Trust, along with CPRE, along with National Trust, RSPB, and many other organisations, have been working very hard over the last few years, as I'm sure you know, in trying to push for that agricultural transition and replacing the Common Agricultural Policy with what are now called environmental land management schemes, which DEFRA has produced, so that we're paying where public money, where subsidies are used, they're to pay for public goods rather than just paying for what the market can pay for. In other words, food. And so broadly, the government has gone with that, and that's very welcome. It's welcome that we have got this shift to public money for public goods. But overall, we and other environmental organisations have been quite disappointed about the lack of ambition in environmental land management schemes, and particularly the so-called sustainable farming incentive. It has got some real problems with it in lack of ambition. We were promised it would support farmers to move to integrated pest management, but it hasn't done that yet. They said they will add that on in years 2 or 3 of the scheme. But I mean, the clue's in the name, isn't it? If it's integrated pest management, it should be integrated from the outset, not something bolted on later on. So we feel it's been really disappointing. The level of ambition from government on environmental land management schemes hasn't really delivered on the promises that we were made, and we will keep pushing government to really make sure that it improves that, because ultimately we need farmers to be supported in this transition to more sustainable agriculture. But we do think part of that is also about providing farmers with the support, for example, to remove old silage units that are overflowing and leaking at the moment, providing farmers with the support for capital investment in the countryside to make those changes that are required to move to a more sustainable transition. And the other point in this is we absolutely need the government to be more joined up on an approach to agriculture around, for example, trade deals. It is appalling at the moment. This is where we are absolutely shoulder to shoulder with the National Farmers Union, for example. It's appalling how the government is desperately trying to agree trade deals around the world at the moment, which will allow imports of food to the UK that are produced to lower animal welfare and environmental standards than that required of British farmers. How can that be right? I think we've all got to really expose and question the government over that approach. So lots to think about there about food, but it can be done. And if you think, well, how does this all add up in terms of the amount of land that's needed? I'll give you one amazing statistic that came from the National Food Strategy that was published by Henry Dimbleby for government last year, in which he indicated that 20% of our most marginal agricultural land in this country produces only 1% of the calories consumed in the UK. So actually, if we make much better use of that land for putting nature in recovery, that will actually help us in producing better food. There's no such thing as food security if nature continues to be in decline. We have to put nature in recovery if we're going to be able to grow food sustainably in this country in the longer term. So the third heading I was going to talk about how the countryside can help us tackle the climate emergency is around energy. And again, that of course has been another topic recently that has had a lot of attention following the crisis in Ukraine. And sadly, yet again, I think a lot of the narratives have got it entirely wrong. You know, for the suggestion that the kind of narrative is, oh, well, because of this energy crisis, because of high fossil fuel prices, maybe we need to pump more fossil fuels here in the UK. Maybe we need to go back to fracking. Maybe we need to pump more oil and gas from the North Sea, and so on. You would have all heard that. But again, we need to ask ourselves this question: why is it that after 50, 60 years of exploiting oil and gas from the North Sea and getting as much as we can from there, we find ourselves in a situation where we're now highly dependent on foreign imports of energy? It hasn't worked. Again, it hasn't produced long-term energy security for the UK. And obviously, when you factor in climate change, as long as we remain addicted to fossil fuels, we will continue to be causing problems that result of climate change and continue to be vulnerable to international prices on fossil fuels. So I would say again, if ever this was a moment for us to put a really strong focus on energy efficiency and producing energy sustainably in this country, this is it. And I want to say a thing or two about energy efficiency, because you know, it is ridiculous how little attention this has received over the years. The most sustainable form of electricity, of energy production, is that you don't need to produce, unquestionably. And we still waste so much energy in this country. The vast majority of our housing stock are leaky housing. The vast majority of our industrial complexes could be a lot more efficient than they currently are. And our vehicles as well. Actually, the improvements we've seen in energy efficiency for our transport in this country have been by and large incremental rather than transformational, even though the technology exists to deliver a lot more. And it's actually because successive governments have really failed to put the time and effort in to put the policies in place to make sure that energy efficiency is given the primary focus in our energy policy. And there's two things about energy efficiency that are really important. One is obvious: you use less energy, you don't need to generate so much. But the second that is often overlooked is that so much of our generating capacity that we need is about the peaks of energy demand, supplying the peaks of energy demand rather than what is there at any one time. And energy efficiency can actually reduce what is the anticipated peaks in demand. So we would need less generating capacity if we got much more focused on energy efficiency. And of course, if we can make sure our housing stock is much more energy efficient, then it also opens up possibilities for new forms, new technologies that don't deliver quite so much heat, for example, but are much more sustainable. So for example, heat pumps, be they air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps, that in countryside properties have the ability to eradicate the need for those horrible colour gas tanks and so on for people that are off grid. They have huge opportunities in countryside properties, but we need to make sure that houses are well insulated for the heat pumps to work. So the countryside and countryside communities can do so much on helping on energy through a really clear focus around energy efficiency, and then of course making sure that all properties, why are we still building new houses that are built to low energy efficiency standards or don't have rooftop solar on them built in and other forms of renewables, heat pumps built in from the outset? It just seems absolutely crazy that that is not happening at the moment. I know it's a bit more controversial, but I think there is a role for onshore wind. Of course, we need onshore wind done right in the right places. And if it's managed in the right way, that can be done in a way that helps restore nature. You can have nature alongside onshore wind at the same time. The same even with solar as well, large-scale solar. If it's done right, you can actually create wildflower meadows alongside solar as well. It won't be right in all locations, we know that, but in many it can be, and it's got to be done right. And we need to think about how we can get these co-benefits on this. And the one thing I would say on that, much as we might not always like onshore wind in every location and so on, it doesn't cause permanent damage. So, if in 50 years' time, you don't need that onshore wind farm anymore, it won't have caused permanent damage, whereas lots of other forms of energy production certainly do cause permanent damage. So I think there's huge opportunities around energy, and we could talk many more about the possibilities there as well. But I think the potential for the countryside to help tackle climate change in generating energy close to home rather over long distances where you lose perhaps sometimes 20% through transmission as well, in a much more decentralized way, could be really important. The fourth topic I just wanted to say a few words about is around climate adaptation, because we have no hope of adapting to the climate change we've already got locked in unless we can make sure that the countryside is helping us do that. And you would have seen the incredibly important report published on UK climate risk last year, perhaps by the Climate Change Committee, which broadly said, amongst other things, if we're heading for 2 degrees of warming, we need a huge amounts of adaptation to that. We need to hold much more water back in the landscape, because if water in extreme weather events rushes off the land into our rivers, we will get a lot more flooding. So we need to hold water back in the landscape through wetlands, through making sure that our soils, bare soils, are covered through changes in agricultural practice. But we also need to be thinking about the need to help nature adapt. And when we talk about things like nature recovery networks and think about our nature reserves at the moment, actually, they're not going to be good enough in a changing climate. If you have a 2-degree increase in temperatures from today, well, actually, the nature recovery networks we need and where we need our nature reserves to protect nature might be in quite different places to where they are at the moment. So there's a lot to do for us to thinking about how we adapt to the climate change that's already been locked in. But it will be crucially important for society that we do that if the countryside is going to help us tackle the climate emergency. And the final point I want to say, and you might think it sounds a bit airy-fairy, but I think it's actually really important. Of course, what the countryside can help us do, crucially, is reconnect people and nature again. Because perhaps after 200 years of the Industrial Revolution, we've ended up in a situation where too many people in society are disconnected from nature and we feel apart from nature. And ultimately, that, I would suggest, is the cause of a lot of the problems we've been talking about. We don't think enough about the fact that humans are not separate from nature, but they're part of nature. And we often hear people talking about rewilding. One of the things I really want to do is rewild the human. I want to make sure that we all remember we're part of nature and recognize the hugely important role that nature plays in our physical and mental well-being. And my goodness, I think millions of people have come to realize that and appreciate that over the last 2 years, perhaps more than ever before. And I think a future vision for the countryside, particularly in an age of Zoom and Teams and so on, can be that you can have thriving communities living in the countryside, thriving local economies, many more people perhaps working from home with much reduced need for travel, for example, and many more people in society through a thriving, nature-rich, abundant, healthy countryside can actually feel connected to nature again, whether they live in the countryside or whether they live in towns and cities, or indeed whether the boundaries between town and countryside blur a little bit more, but in a good way, not in a bad way, but in a good way, where we bring the countryside, we bring nature into towns and cities, rather than necessarily seeing towns and cities spill into the countryside. Surely that's what we've got to do. We've got to rewild our towns and cities. We've got to rewild our people and our communities. And that is, of course, the massive contribution that the countryside can help to tackle both the climate emergency and the nature emergency, and perhaps the health emergency as well. So lots to think about there. There's many things I haven't had time to talk about, but just to give you a few thoughts to kick off, and let's pick a lot more up in questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. That was wonderfully clear and lucid. I'm sure there are lots and lots of questions for Craig at this point. Who would like to ask a question? We've got a hand up from Mike Roberts. And you're muted.
Usual problem, I'm afraid. Forget to unmute. And I thank you very much, Craig, for that tour de force in relationship to what needs to be done. I'm also one of those people who are a politician. Many people may be aware of that, who operates at every single level. And I find, quite honestly, trying to get people to sign up to policies, whether it's at the local government association, in my own party, which is on the red side, to other areas of policy development, there is still that reluctance, if you're urban, to actually think about the connections, which you made very strong voice on in your presentation. The connections with what is just around the corner, what needs to be done. What more can those people who are in urban areas, and I represent an area which is very deprived in Northeast Hampshire, in an area which is now probably 250,000 people because of the developments which have gone on in Northeast Hampshire and Southwest Surrey and other places. What more can we do to actually influence at the local political level? But more importantly, I've got one of those people who my ear and their ear actually listen to what I say at the national level.
Yeah, really good question, Mike. This is a hugely important area about how can we make sure that essentially nature is for everyone, and actually in a way the countryside is for everyone. At the Wildlife Trust, we are actually launching our new strategy next Thursday, this coming week, and there's a big emphasis in that about how we can reach out into communities, into much more diverse communities than we currently are in, and really try and make sure that nature is for everyone. We're starting a big new project called Next Door Nature, and to make sure that particularly the poorest, most deprived people in society, most deprived communities, can connect to nature on their doorstep and don't feel that they've got to travel a big distance to experience that, and build a better understanding of nature through that and through the countryside. This is crucially important. Equally, we certainly got behind and played a role in the campaign for Natural History GCSE, and we were delighted when just this last week the government announced that they would be doing that. That was very important. And it's funny, I did quite a few media reports, media interviews about that this week, and I found myself thinking, you know, it is absolutely fantastic that we finally got this, but how mad it's taken this long. How mad that, you know, we have in our education system in the past, we have thought it was absolutely essential to learn about all these kind of human invented things, be it economics or business or whatever. And yes, I'm not arguing that that's not important, but we absolutely hadn't been doing a good enough job of teaching our children about what underpins all that, nature. You know, it's easy to kind of forget the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature, not the other way around. And yet we often behave in our politics as if nature is subservient to the economy. But honestly, it's the other way around, as we all know. And so I think education will be very important in that Mike, as well. Making sure the next generation have those abilities to learn about nature and natural processes and climate and so on, but also giving them the tools and the ability to connect to nature on their doorstep and for it to be part of their lives. And again, I know that at that level, that might sound a little bit airy-fairy, but actually how practically we do it is about lots of community-based organizations and volunteers rolling their sleeves up and doing that. That's why it's so important that organizations like CPRE, Wildlife Trusts and others are structured in the way that we are to do just that. Thank you.
Boyd.
Thank you very much, Craig. That was terrific. You struck a number of chords, rang a number of bells with me. Just let me pick up on a couple of them. When you talked about maize being grown in the south of England, chalkland, I mentioned that we'd been doing a project in the western part of the New Forest, and that project was on a part of an estate where they had been doing exactly that. We went down to visit the site about 18 months ago, and there was maize stubble sitting in very dry land. And in fact, the soil was blowing off in front of our very eyes as we watched that maize stubble sitting there. And we've now managed to resow that land and plant hedgerows throughout that large tract and restore it to something closer to what it would have been many years ago. And that's been a really interesting project. Another part of the project has been about education. We've been engaging with schools, with both primary and secondary schools. We've got kids to come out and look at hedgerows and actually understand what lives in a hedgerow and draw the animals and insects and so on that are in hedgerows. And the enthusiasm which those kids showed was fantastic. And we've also brought hedges into the schools and actually planted hedgerows in 2 of the schools in that part of the country, which was terrific. However, had a bigger question, which was just asking you what the level of collaboration is between the Wildlife Trusts and CPRE at both national and local level. We have had good collaboration with the Hampshire AGM White Wildlife Trust. We'd like to do more, but what do you think the state of play is at present, and how can we do more together to achieve the goals which I'm sure we all share?
Yeah, sure. Very good points there. Let me say something about hedgerows actually before I go into the collaboration piece. I mean, I can't enthuse enough about hedgerows, and I know you all do as well, so that's excellent. But there's one thing that we need to think about in this, which perhaps we don't always, is actually also the importance of hedgerow trees, and you know, the trees that so often historically have grown up out of hedgerows as well. And so when we are restoring hedgerows, and obviously to maintain a hedgerow you do need to, you know, cut it and so on, but actually it's important we also leave at times bits sticking out the tops so that
We're pleased to know, Craig, that we've been planting hedgerow trees as well as hedgerows.
Fabulous. I'm so pleased to hear that. I think this is a very important point that sometimes certainly in government policy around hedgerows sometimes gets overlooked. So I think that's a very important thing. On the collaboration, it's a hugely important topic, Boyd. I have to say, I think we have excellent collaboration with CPRE nationally and many other organisations actually. I know Crispin very well, and we talk frequently. Perhaps we don't talk about it enough, but there is a group. There's a group called the White Paper Dinner Group, which sounds a bit mysterious, but it's the chief execs of the main green organisations, and we meet for dinner at least once a quarter to do that. And so that involves Crispin and myself, but also the chief execs of National Trust, or Director General, I should say, Hillary, RSPB, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, and Woodland Trust, and many others. And so we know each other very well. In fact, maybe we shouldn't even say this, but we've even got a WhatsApp group between us all, and we share information and intelligence quite frequently on that. And we have little subgroups come together to work to collaborate very closely on at times as well. And we will have meetings with other stakeholders together very often, whether it be government or NFU and others, as we kind of see fit. And actually just about, what is it, about a month ago, I think it is now, we even had some away days where we got together for a couple of days in a place in Kent to talk about how we can dial up the collaboration even more. So I think it's already, I have to say, in my career, and believe it or not, I've been doing this, I've been working in this sector for about 25 years now. I think the collaboration, certainly nationally, between the sort of big green organisations is better than I've ever seen it. And yet we are now working hard to think how we can make it even better for the future, because it is important. The one thing I would say, however, is I think the diversity of our organisations is also very important, because I mean, I know no one's suggesting it, but the worst thing we could do is all merge and try and become one. I think it's actually really good that we've all got slightly different unique selling points. We all slightly different areas of focus, different audiences, and together, you put that together, I think it makes us much stronger overall. You know, there's a reason Unilever produces more than one brand of margarine, and it's because overall they can sell more margarine. And I think having lots of strong environment organisations that collaborate well together and work alongside each other means overall we'll be stronger. But always open to new ideas as well.
Thank you very much.
Russell, Russell Webb, I think you had your hand up.
Thank you. Excellent talk, Craig. Much appreciated. Two things I want to mention, bearing in mind the cost of living and how people are going to pay for green energy, which is an issue which environmentalists haven't actually tackled. I mean, I've got solar panels, I've got a heat source pump, and I'm fine. But bearing in mind that we should, I think we should really concentrate on our own indigenous sources of power, and dare I mention fracking and North Sea oil and gas, because otherwise I agree that too much power is being exported from Russia. I believe we're only importing about 4% of Russian gas compared to much higher quantities for other European states. But I do feel that we should concentrate on, say, natural, our own sources of power. And the other thing is regarding food. I feel we should be far more self-sufficient in food rather than importing, for example, vegetables, which we could grow quite easily now, rather than importing, and also helping the cost of living. All right. Okay.
Yeah, okay, bunch of things to just mention there. I'll throw in something else as well that you didn't even mention, but I'll say it. Obviously, the cost of living crisis is right up front in people's minds at the moment, and is a very real thing. It's very, very concerning. But you have to ask, well, why has it come about? One of the reasons it's come about is because of our dependence on fossil fuels. I mean, this is the irony of this conversation. Every time you hear people sort of say, well, the answer to this is to pump more fossil fuels. Actually, no, that's exactly what's got us in this mess in the first place, I would say. You know, fundamentally, the cheapest energy production long term will be that we get for free from the sun and the wind and the waves and the tides, or indeed the energy efficiency that means we don't need it in the first place. And it's because we've underinvested in those historically that now we are facing these very very sort of very sudden price variations, and which we can't kind of control. So I certainly think the first thing we should be doing, primarily about cost of living and around energy, is to try and get an absolute transformation in investment in energy efficiency. You know, the government produced their so-called energy strategy in response to Ukraine, and it was totally upside down. I mean, it was hard to think about how it could be more wrong, actually. It kind of put nuclear up top, and which is the most expensive form of energy generation there is, and the one that takes the longest to produce, even if you don't have a problem with other issues around nuclear. It hardly mentioned anything about energy efficiency. It should have been exactly the opposite way around. If they were really caring about cost of living, if the government was serious about this at the moment, they could be ramping up energy efficiency measures right now in a way that could help people retrofit their homes over the summer and autumn months, producing loads of jobs locally right across the country, not just in individual key areas. The best way to do that would be through, yes, grants, but also 0% interest loans. I do not know why the government isn't more comfortable to do that, because then people, I think, would do that rather than high interest loans and so on, which even when they did the Green Deal was not really a very good advantage in terms of that. And that's what would make a real difference. And it certainly could do that by next winter, but it would certainly do it over the next 5 years, which would be very important. As for fracking and North Sea oil and gas, I mean, I really disagree on that. For a start, obviously, that would be a disaster from a climate point of view. You know, we have to stop burning fossil fuels as quickly as we can. Now, you know, I still have a gas boiler, unfortunately. I hope to change that one day. And, you know, I have a car that uses a bit of petrol. It's a plug-in hybrid, but uses some petrol. So we are still all dependent on it. But oil and gas facilities exist. We are all still pumping oil and gas to the North Sea. What we don't want to do is create new fossil fuel infrastructure that locks us into continuing use in the long term. So maybe use the infrastructure you've already got during the transition. But the last thing we want to do is create new infrastructure that locks us in longer than we need to. And if we allowed fracking, that certainly would do that. If we start creating new fossil fuel infrastructure in the North Sea, that will lock it in. And I don't believe for 1 minute that the companies that would do that would be very happy to then shut it down in 10 years from now. But the real problem on that also is, of course, then apart from climate, is would still be vulnerable to international prices, because you could not, any gas produced here, whether it's through fracking or North Sea in this country, would be sold on the international market. And you would have to produce vast amounts of it to make any difference to prices in the UK. There were some estimates done about 3 years ago when the whole fracking debate was at its height, that you would need something like 3,000 frac pads across the UK to make any difference to international gas prices and the price of gas here in the UK. So that would result in the countryside being industrialized on a vast scale, and actually in a way that isn't going to help us tackle climate change. So I really think that is the wrong direction to go on that. The final thing I just want to say a little bit is about nuclear, since it received, you know, that huge endorsement from the Prime Minister recently with plans to build a new 8 nuclear power stations. I mean, I think it's absurd, in all honesty. It is the most expensive form of energy production there is. Those nuclear power stations are not going to be built anytime soon. It's going to take 15, 20, 25 years at the quickest, when actually we need to be halving emissions within the next 8 years. So it's not going to make any difference for helping climate change. There would be big centralized energy production, which is completely against the trends where energy is going, which is to much more decentralized energy production. Remember, you can lose 15 to 20% of energy produced over long distance transmission. It's an old style energy model that assumes that we need big base load in our energy grid, which we don't anymore. You know, it was 5 years ago, the chief executive of the National Grid said base load is an old, outdated concept from the 1970s and 1980s. We don't need it anymore. And actually what we need is locally produced energy and energy efficiency and decentralized energy and smart grids that lead to a much more variable grid. And we need energy storage as well, rather than big old fashioned nuclear power stations. So I think it's really disturbing how sort of industry lobbyists have been so successful in government here in trying to create new age of nuclear. And then the big problem is, I don't believe they're going to be built. I don't believe we're going to get 8 new nuclear power stations. Even if I thought they were good things, they're not going to happen. We might perhaps get one more, Sizewell C maybe, which is actually 2, Sizewell C and D, in truth, it's 2 reactors and so on. And so the real problem, another big problem here, is that we depend on them. We think they're going to be the solution, and then they don't appear. And so we end up stuck exactly where we are. We don't put the attention that we should do in energy efficiency and renewables, which is the real answer. And a final word for you, also, I think this is important to share with the CPRE audience. When you hear people talk about small modular reactors, there's a couple of things to say about them. They're not small and they're not modular. So they actually, they might be a little bit smaller than Sizewell C, say, or whatever, but they make you sort of think, oh, they're about the size of your hot water tank at home or something. They're not. A small modular reactor would still represent a very big industrial development in the countryside. and not just the reactor itself, but the whole infrastructure that goes with it. And maybe aspects of it would be modular, these reactors themselves, but obviously not all the infrastructure that goes with it, all the electricity, the power lines and so on that would go across the countryside for modular reactors. So I would be really wary in questioning of them. I think small modular reactors are a huge success in terms of branding, but not really a massive step forward in terms of sustainable energy generation. So just watch out for that one.
Thank you. I think I've got two questions pending, one from Alan Drinkwater, another from John Lowry. Alan.
Oh, thank you. I'm wondering if there's a gap which could be filled, but could be filled very helpfully by the sort of, if I use the word, principles that Craig has just talked us through for the countryside. And that is, can these same principles be applied to gardens in urban areas, whereby you want open plan gardens to allow hedgehogs to wander around? You don't want brick walls which stop them and birds and anything else going under them. You also could minimize on pesticides and herbicides and all the rest of it, the chemical pollution of the soil. I did offer to our neighbourhood planning people in Rowlands Castle, preparing a neighbourhood plan, the principles of guidelines for developments, and included these very points. Rather than having high fences, high walls. Some cases they're essential, you have children or dogs or pets. Other cases, they irrelevant. I wonder if the Royal Horticultural Society, Wesley, could have a part in its role in horticulture, in propagating those principles that Craig so clearly put before us. Thank you.
Alan, I completely agree. Not much more to add. I mean, I absolutely agree. One of the things I say is when we talk about 30 by 30, getting 30% of our land and sea into recovery by 2030, that can happen at any scale, and it can happen at the scale of your garden. If you can think about maybe making sure that around a third of your garden is managed for nature, that's a great thing to do. One of the best things you can do in that is putting in a pond, for example, a wildlife pond, and it only has to be very small. But it can make a huge difference for nature. And the connectivity, again, as you say, is very important. So little holes in fences, or even better, hedges and so on, to allow hedgehogs and other animals to go. And absolutely right about making sure, try and avoid all use of pesticides if you can, or if you are going to use them, just use them on a very limited spot treatment basis. So you know, I couldn't agree more, Alan.
Thank you. I think I'm going to limit it. I've got John Lowry's first, and then Danny Lee, and I think Danny must be the last question today. John.
Craig, thank you very much for an extremely eloquent review of the relationship between the countryside and the climate change challenge. And I think what was particularly positive about what you said is that you had a lot of suggestions about what we could do. You weren't just simply listing all the problems we face. There's one thing you didn't mention, which is a concern, I think, for CPRE, which is the whole issue of transport. We are locked into systems of transport which essentially are consuming lots of fossil fuels, and we're still projecting increases. I mean, the 8 major airports in the UK are projecting expansion to accommodate 50% more passengers in the next 15 or so years. We know that, you know, Highways England has got a vastly bigger budget to develop the road system than is the budget for public transport, particularly railways and so on. I wondered if you want to make a few comments on that issue.
John, I think there's more than one thing I didn't mention, actually. I think there's plenty of things I didn't mention in my talk in the time I had, but you're absolutely right to highlight transport and just what an important issue it is. I mean, one of the comments I did make a little bit was around, I think we have seen a profound shift as a result of the COVID pandemic and so on, into people needing to travel less now. You know, we have over the last 2 years learned that in many organizations you can work very effectively in doing what we're doing now. I mean, 2 years ago, if you'd wanted me to speak at this, unquestionably, you would have invited me to come down and join you in Hampshire, and you would have been having your AGM face to face, and there would be nice benefits of that. But equally, to be honest, because of family commitments, I couldn't have joined you this weekend if you'd insisted that I had to come down to Hampshire, much as I love Hampshire. And I live in Cambridge. So it's amazing. We are looking right now at the huge transformation that's taking place. And the important thing about this is it was already happening before COVID happened. That's why I think it's a trend that will last. You know, it's not just a blip that we all sort of work more on Zoom and Teams now. I think what the pandemic did is sped it up and give it an enormous boost, this ways of working now, and it will move even faster. And of course, the technology we're using right now to look at each other is still the equivalent of the brick-sized mobile phones from the 1980s. You know, it's nothing compared to where we're going to be in 5 or 10 years' time in ways we can't even imagine how perhaps immersive it will be in how we can link up like this. We still want to do the face-to-face. We still want to do travel occasionally, of course. But actually, unquestionably, to my mind, there could and should be a big reduction in the need for travel as a result of this emerging technology and this cultural change that's now come about. And it's really depressing how the government has failed to embrace that. You know, this is a good thing rather than a bad thing. And instead, what you have is the absurd situation where government is trying to insist that civil servants work in offices in Whitehall 5 days a week. No one wants to do that. It's not even efficient or effective, to my mind, in any organisations. Yes, go to offices perhaps 2 or 3 days a week, but not 5 days a week. So we can see a big reduction in the need for transport, I think, and ultimately that's the first thing that will make a huge difference on the points you talk about. But the second thing is also understanding how that can help revitalise local communities. I mean, just one thing, there's been a lot of talk about how the pandemic you know, caused harm for those sandwich bars in the middle of London, and you know, it was a real problem for Pret-a-Manger because less people were eating sandwiches in Pret-a-Manger in the middle of London and those kind of places. But certainly where I live, in the suburb I live in, Cambridge, you know, our locally run sandwich shops and our local deli and so on absolutely loved it, because suddenly people like me that were working at home were buying stuff in our local shops rather than in Pret-a-Manger in London or whatever. And the same will be in the countryside. People who work from home in the countryside will spend money in village shops and in the village pub a lot more and things like that. And that's good for our local economy. And it's really frustrating how policymakers aren't embracing this as a good thing at the moment, instead of almost trying to work against it. And if we can get a reduction in the need for travel, then there will be less demand to build new roads and all of these airports and things like that. It's not saying that people won't travel, of course they will, but we can have a big reduction in the need for it, as well as, of course, making sure that there's modal shifts, cycling, walking, all of those things. And when we do travel in cars, making sure they're zero emission and so on. So I think there's huge opportunities here, but at the moment, we've just not got the kind of political thinking that's needed, I would say, from any of the parties, any of the main parties at the moment, to embrace this as a good thing that can be good for the climate, good for nature and good for people.
Sorry, my telephone is going. Finally, a question from Danny Lee. I think we.
Yeah. Thank you, James. Apologies for my video not working. Craig, I just wanted to congratulate you on the joined up thinking about how countryside can help the climate change. I wanted to add my concern about the International Panel on Climate Change, Code Red for Humanity, and the fact that 3 working group reports have for the first time synthesized and brought together the vulnerabilities and challenges that we face. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. And I think you invoked that in some of the things you were saying. So fantastic. And it is really disappointing with the local elections coming up and the way that our politicians talk, that they haven't factored in the COP26 thinking or these recent reports, which I agree are difficult to read, but there are digestible chunks out there to interpret. I just want to pick up on one of the interpretations. If the climate change temperature rise is roughly where we're talking, and it's fastly on its way to 1.5 degrees C, 3/4 of that temperature rise is carbon emissions, and something like 1/2 degree is methane. And then picking up your point, Craig, about nature and farming, and that in fact, agriculture is the biggest culprit in that problem with methane. And the reason I'm focusing on methane is that it is a short-lived climate warming potential emission. But the key thing is that we have at our hands readily available interventions to tackle that. And I just thought, Craig, would you be picking that up on that in your strategy, and what can CPRE do?
Danny, you're absolutely right. You're bang on right. There is, in lots of things you said there. I mean, the first thing about the IPCC report's very, very concerning. And it's worth emphasizing just a few things. I think we've become a bit too used to hearing about 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and so on. Remember I said earlier, and it doesn't sound very much, does it, the difference between them? Remember I said earlier the difference between an ice age and a warm period like this is only about 4 or 5 degrees average temperature difference. And think, you know, that would have led to 4 or 5 degrees average temperature less would have led to ice, certainly over where I am here in Cambridge at the moment. Might just have reached Hampshire, maybe not, but you certainly would have been in a very different situation. And for too many people, that temperature difference doesn't sound very, very much, but it is a huge difference. And actually, as we know, the difference between keeping temperature rises at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, bear in mind we're over 1 now, and 2 degrees, well, 1.5 to 2 degrees is the difference between whether coral reefs exist or not. It's the difference between the Amazon rainforest tipping into a source of carbon rather than a sink. It's the difference probably between whether the tundra actually thaws and releases yet more of that methane that you're talking about. And you're absolutely right to put the spotlight on methane. It's not had enough attention over the years. It should have had more, including, I would say, from environmental organisations. It is one of the reasons that environmental organisations opposed fracking, I should say, because there's been a big spike of methane in the last few years. Some of it appears to have come from wetlands that could be, as they warm in the tropics in particular, seem to release more methane, but a lot of it seems to be associated with fracking industries, actually, in the United States. And, you know, so-called fugitive methane from fracking really raises questions about whether fracking is necessarily any better than for the climate than burning coal. And that's a big area of debate, but certainly the very fact it's an area of debate means we should worry. And there's huge amounts of methane still coming from existing fossil fuel infrastructure. So when you say, what could you do as CPRE? Well, specifically CPRE Hampshire, I'd invite you to think about the huge fossil fuel refineries you have down in Southampton. Perhaps a bit of attention on those to make sure that they are stopping fugitive emissions of methane there. Might be quite a good thing to do there as well. Those are huge refineries for the UK. And actually, are they doing everything they could be doing to stop methane emissions down in Fawley? My guess is they're probably not, actually. So maybe a little bit of attention on that might be quite useful. Oh,
Great.
You're actually, I didn't even say about, Danny, about farming. You're absolutely right. Big releases of methane from farming as well. So, and again, associated with a lot of that with meat production. So it gets back to my comments around that before.
Self-sufficiency in food. I mentioned that, haven't you?
And I think at that point, we really ought to say thank you very much to Craig. And
Mr. Chairman, could I just interrupt? Sorry, apologies. Victoria Weston has had her hand up for some time. I just wonder if you would permit one further question, quick one.
Thank you so much. Am I allowed to ask my question?
absolutely. I can't see you on my screen, I'm afraid, but
that's no problem. And thank you very much for raising that. Is that Boyd? Thank you so much for doing that for me. Okay, basically, it's really on nature. I want to go back to nature recovery, and I just want to ask, how can you support to make sure that nature recovery is actually on every parish council's agenda, and so we're actually getting down to the local roots and the local people, and so people are understanding it locally. Because as you said, everyone can do their little bit, but at the moment, you know, people just think it's too big and they can't cope with it. But if everyone is doing their little tiny bit and helping, then that will just build up the education to the next generations and just escalate it. And the other thing with nature recovery, one of the big issues we see in Hampshire and in our area is roadkill from speeding, and we have very little support from the police or from the Hampshire County Council to actually reducing speeding. It's a really hard task, and it's just so sad to see so many animals killed on our roads. One of our roads, that when I used to travel into Winchester, I just used to call it Roadkill Road, and I would every day there would be 5 or 6 different types of birds or animals killed on that road, and that's just because people are driving far too fast. So those are 2 issues that I'd like you to ask if you can take up and try and help support and try and get nature recovery on every parish council's agenda, please.
Really, really good question there, Victoria. Thank you very much. The Environment Bill that became the Environment Act last year, something that all the big green NGOs collaborated on to make sure happened. And one of the things we really push for is a duty on public bodies, and particularly local authorities, to try and promote nature's recovery, and specifically to produce local nature recovery strategies. So there is a requirement now on local public bodies to produce local nature recovery strategies. So one of the things that will be important to do is to emphasize and promote and make sure that local authorities, be they county councils or parish councils, whatever, are engaged in producing those local nature recovery strategies, and then they are implemented. And within that, I would say that's where a lot of that could be, quite high level, and it could produce nature recovery network mapping, for example. That's a good thing to do, but actually, how do you make it bite? How do you hold it? So what you then need to do is try and get that established in planning policy, so that it's recognised which areas are needed to be protected for nature recovery. That's again where it links into where we think as the Wildlife Trust we need a new designation called Wild Belt, so that you could actually designate areas and if you've identified in a local nature recovery strategy that an area is needed to be restored for nature, for wider nature recovery, then let's designate it as such, and everyone knows that's what it's there for. But also issues about, say, roadside verges, allowing roadside verges to go wild and maintain those as wildflower meadows rather than cutting them to an inch of their lives. And funny enough, that might link to the speeding issue as well. You never know. A lot of speeding happens in certain environments, in road environments, where there's little nudges that can be done to slow people down. And obviously the ones that we're used to are things like speed bumps and so on, but actually it doesn't have to be just that. It can be if you create in transport environments, if you kind of create these visual cues that make people kind of think of it more as a community situation rather than necessarily a motorway, then people will behave differently. And so when you see kind of road calming measures that we're familiar with in urban environments, that might be just changing the road surface, or it might create a few more bends or something like that. And that can be more effective at slowing people down actually than speed cameras and all of those. And this is just my hunch, but I think allowing roadside verges to go a bit wilder and actually having some signs up that show about animals crossing, toad crossing and so on, it might just help be one of those measures that helps slow people down a bit as well. But you've raised a really important point. There needs to be a lot more effort done to do that.
Thank you. And I'm having missed the last questioner. Are there any other questions from any other parties I haven't seen? It's a silence. Craig, I think we have to say at this point, thank you very much indeed. You are a fantastic communicator, very, very lucid, and we're very grateful to you for an hour and a quarter of your time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, and thanks for everything you do at CPRE Hampshire, and I hope we get to work together more in the future. Thank you. I'll leave you to go.
Thanks very much, Craig. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
And that's it, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for attending.
Thank you, James, for chairing.